Great. Josh,
Howie,
thanks for joining us here.
thank you for having me.
So I've known you for 6 years now?
7
years.
Would have been since 2012.
2012. Okay, so I
Right.
met you freshman year. So just tell me about that. Actually, I should know the story, but remind me, how did we first meet?
Well, I just barely scraped by my way into Duke.
Okay.
I got in off the wait list. and I came to school, wanting to be an economics major.
Okay.
Decided I loved business, wanted to start a business.
Yep.
And I said, how do I do this? So I went to my friends at what was called Incube at the time, and
Yep.
is now called
The Cube.
The Cube.
Yep. Selective living group on campus.
Right.
For Duke undergrads.
Right, for entrepreneurs. And I went to my friend that was in that group and said, how do I get started with this stuff?
Okay.
I think it's cool.
Yeah.
And he introduced me to you, and I had a meeting with your office, and in your office.
Yep.
I was very intimidated, a very nervous freshman.
Okay.
I've grown out of that a little bit, but I remember it being an awesome meeting and a really inspirational meeting.
I still feel like a nervous freshman sometimes. So,
Right.
so and then I remember we talked. I remember we talked one summer while you were working out of your apartment. I think you were working on some like web design stuff. Does that sound
Right.
familiar? That might have been like sophomore summer-ish?
That was the summer after my freshman year.
That was summer
So-
after freshman year.
Right,
Okay.
so
okay.
I knew I wanted to start something, wasn't really sure
Got
where to
it.
start.
Yep.
And so I went around to all the restaurants in Durham and offered to make them websites.
Right.
I got paid in a lot of envelopes. It kind of felt like being a drug dealer. People would give me like $200, $300
Cash in an envelope?
Right, cash
Oh,
in an
that's funny.
envelope for like a website. And that was really how I got kind of my first taste.
So that was
of-
first summer. That was freshman summer.
It was freshman summer, and I was living on Jake and Tati's
with
couch.
Jake and Tati's couch.
Who we'll catch up on.
Yes,
I think
we'll
later.
talk about them a little bit later.
Right.
Jake Stott
Right.
and Tati Bergeson. So talk to me about how you ended up getting the idea of FarmShots.
Right. So I, it was the summer after my sophomore year.
Yep.
Knew I really liked farming. Didn't want to go work for one of the big tech companies out there.
Okay.
So I went to go work for a local group called the International Farming Corporation.
Yep.
And they're a land manager, and they buy a lot of farmland, sell a lot of farmland.
Big company.
Big company. Well, small in terms of number of people.
Okay.
At the time.
Okay.
And they had agronomists on staff who are the people that go out and advise their farmers, right?
Yep.
And so these agronomists would drive around to all of their different farms and go
Yep.
ahead and say, we think you got a problem here, you got a problem there. Talking with them, I learned that back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of research into using satellites to pick out where there was a disease or a bug
Right.
on a farm.
Right.
And the way that works is you think about a healthy plant absorbs light, so the unhealthy plants by the same token reflect that light, and the satellites can pick up on that. So I started investigating that a little more. I really wanted to build a product for these people.
Yep.
And found out that, circa, I guess this would have been 2015, there had been a ton more satellites put into space. So now we were almost getting an image of the Earth every week, every 2 weeks. And so the idea behind the product of taking the satellite imagery and turning it into something useful that replaces the agronomist
Yep.
driving around the farm
Yep.
was all of a sudden feasible, and
Right.
it only become feasible in the last, year.
The idea had been around for a while, but
Right.
now it's like we can actually do
Right,
it.
right,
Okay.
right.
And so you were interning at IFC.
Mm-hmm.
You had this idea.
Right.
And just talk about that transition from being an intern
Yeah.
to, hey, I'm thinking of doing this.
Yeah.
Like, would you work with me to do that?
Yeah. So kind of over the weekends and during the nights, I built the first version of the product.
Okay. You're a coder.
With a couple of my buddies.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm a terrible coder,
You're
but
a terrible
I did my
coder.
best.
Right? A good enough coder, then,
but-
maybe.
Depends on how you think about it. Brought the first version of the software to the folks at IFC and said, hey, what do you think?
Yep.
Right, and they were like, it's kind of crappy.
Okay.
They're like, I don't know, we don't really.
Not the reception you were hoping for.
Right, it was not that great, and so I said, well, why? What could we do better?
Yeah.
And then I went back the next week with those revisions and said, what do you think now? And they're like, still not that great.
Yeah.
Right, and I kind of did that week after week after week after week.
Yeah.
Until at the end of the summer, they were like, this could be useful. Right, we could see how this could be useful.
Okay.
And so they became my first investor and great friends and mentors through the entire
So that's end of sophomore summer.
end of sophomore summer.
And talk about, so at this point you're in the Melissa and Doug Entrepreneurs Program, because that ran from like, or not quite then.
No, I wasn't.
You were, yeah,
That was
that's
the summer
right.
I was in
Yeah.
it.
That was the summer, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So that was January of basically like or February of freshman, fall, spring.
Right. Through the.
I'm sorry, no, sophomore spring. February, sophomore spring through the fall of junior year. And so just talk about being in that program and any ways that was helpful to you as you were thinking of leaving, being an intern and starting this company.
Right. It was first of all, the problem was I hadn't had that much contact with entrepreneurs at that point. I didn't really know what it meant to be an entrepreneur, what that kind of success could look like, what the kind of failures could look like. And so all of a sudden having Melissa and Doug, right, as people who I could look up to and say like, okay, this is a normal career path. This is something that could pay off very well, be a great life experience. Having that example, I think was like the first and foremost value. On top of that, I got assigned a bunch of mentors in the agriculture space. I was not a farmer growing up. I just really kind of fell in love with it as time went on. And so having the Melissa and Doug mentors get assigned to me who had grown up in the space, worked in the space was incredibly valuable.
Right. So let's dive in a little bit on the mentors. So do you mind, are you comfortable kind of calling out any mentors and saying, this is a person that I worked with who was great, and maybe just talk about why they were helpful?
I mean, the biggest one was Chris Rhodes. Who was at AGCO. And so he actually ended up on the board of my company.
Formerly worked at John Deere.
And he was always the one that set me straight whenever I was panicked about anything. He's like, stop worrying, just get to work. Right. And him, both the industry contact, but also just the industry expertise and the strategy of the company really helped define how it grew. Also still had the guys from IFC on the team. And so that was incredible as well.
So they were helpful. So Chris, and Chris, just to go back to Chris for a second, as an example, you've still been in touch with him up until
I'm supposed to call him this weekend.
You're supposed to call him this weekend,
supposed to call him this weekend.
So that's a relationship that's been in your life for 5 years at this point. Roughly 5 years,
he moved from a mentor to a friend to a board member, and now he's all three of those.
That's great. That's great. So talk about what happens after the Melissa and Doug Entrepreneurs Program. So, now you're kind of starting on the path, and maybe more importantly, IFC has put in some money in order to help kind of seed the company. So now you're a junior, and it's your spring semester. You still have classes. And you have some friends that have been working with you on this. Talk about the experience of trying to run a tech startup while you're taking classes. As a junior, you still have a year ahead of you.
And junior is supposed to be the hardest. It was interesting, right? I think I didn't end up getting good grades, and part of the experience was learning to be okay with that. You can't do everything in life. You can't be a good friend, good at sleeping, good at partying, good at working and on your company and good at grades at the same time. And a lot of people would like to believe that you can. It's better to do a great job at a couple things than a mediocre job at 10 things. And that's always been my philosophy. So, it was tough. You give up a lot of time with friends and with family and with loved ones. I think that was more the sacrifice than classes. Right. And so for me, the biggest emotional challenge was working on the company instead of being with my friends and loved ones, more so than it was working on the company instead of grades and classes. And so talk about the team you put together. Who were they, and how did you keep them together? Because they, as we've seen with a lot of student startups, they all have pressures that are pulling them in different ways too, whether it's jobs or medical school or whatnot. So who were they, and how'd you work with them? They were all close friends of mine. I think that was the first thing. So they all kind of trusted me, loved me, and they said, "Hey, I've got this crazy idea, and I need you guys." And that kind of brought everyone on. And I think it's up to the CEO of a company. If someone leaves, there are external pressures, but it's up to you to be the person that's inspirational enough for them to stay around. And that doesn't always work out. It's not like we had everyone stick around. In fact, most people did end up leaving, and we had a lot of churn with the company at the start. But all of these people were friends of mine and people that I had worked with already for 1-2 years through school. And I said, hey, let's go on this adventure together, right? And if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But we're going to learn a lot. And that was I think the way we kept them together, or I kept them together, was saying, look how much you're learning, even if you're not making that much money, or things aren't looking that great.
Yeah, and so that's really interesting, because certainly there are plenty of startups, student startups, that the kind of the founding team, that relationship a lot of times doesn't go well. So I'm sure that there were times when there were disagreements on the team or things like that. Do you have any tips for how you made that work? Like, how did you get through disagreements? How did you get through people that maybe told you, hey, I would like to work here, but I also want to work at some big company, and I'm really struggling with that, or I can only do a few hours. So how did you navigate some of that?
We kind of had to pick and choose, right? So the people who were like, hey, I want to go work at a big company, or I want to go to medical school. Sometimes we needed those people, and so it was it was a line to toe where we had to say, hey, we're willing to have you for 10 hours a week. The point was to not have to count on the people who weren't entirely in it. Right. So if you were not 100%, you were not a critical person.
Not critical path.
Not critical path to the company. Okay. So when it comes to disagreements, I mean, the first thing to always do is assume you're wrong, right? So like when someone disagrees with you, it's like, okay, why am I wrong? And that's always the best way to empathize with where someone else is coming from.
It's good. I like the way that way to think about it.
That's where you turn it on its head and you say, okay, how do I prove to myself? You've got to prove to yourself that you're right before you can prove to anyone else. And so those things have to be really well thought out. Right.
Good. Talk a little bit about sales. So again, one of the things that I've talked about recently with Melissa and Doug is that, and the next thing is sales, selling it, being able to get it out there, that, even if you do have the perfect product, if you can't sell it, if you're not good at sales, then it's not going to go anywhere. And so I felt like early on, like in the first year or so, I felt like you were good. Like I felt like I was on the ball and you were making stuff happen. And I felt like every time we would touch base, you'd be like, "Hey, I closed another deal." So just talk a little bit about those early sales. How did that go? And maybe talk more about sales overall.
Right. I mean, deep down, I'm an engineer at heart, right? So I would rather be there writing code, even if I'm bad at it, than out there on the phone. So to some extent, I had to force myself into doing sales, and through that came to love it. Maybe not love it. I only like it today. And part of that is you have to convince you're not going to be able to sell something that you don't believe in. Right. Unless you, depending on what kind of person you are, you're only going to be able to sell a product if you think that by selling this product to someone, you're helping someone. That for every $1 they spend on you, you're giving them $10 back. And so then you have to have almost like an ethical obligation to bring your product to market to help these people. And so if you're out there and you're feeling like, oh, I just got to earn money, that's wrong. It's got to be more like this. I believe in this so much that I'm trying to help people. I'm out there on a do-good mission. And if I get compensated for it at the end, great. If not, so what? But it's my job to bring that out there. I think at some point, as a founder, you're always selling ahead of where your product is. And so you have to sell that vision. And I think the toughest thing for me with that was, you don't exaggerate, right? But you do have to sell, hey, here's what's gonna happen. And that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always work out, and sometimes you let people down. And that was maybe the most challenging part of sales for me, was coming to market with a product, and then 10% of people, 20% of people we'd let down at the start. And that always felt really awful.
So like, what's the range that you can kind of tell this is coming versus that's interesting. So then let's go forward in the story here. So I forget what year it was, but at some point you raised a round of funding.
Raised a round of funding right as I graduated.
Which was how much money?
About $700,000.
$700,000. And also you applied to Y Combinator. And got accepted into their fellowship program. Which I don't think exists right now in the exact same.
It only existed for 3 years.
Only existed for 3 years, but was basically like almost like a remote option for being in YC. I think those two things happened around the same time. The funding and YC.
So YC happened maybe a month before the funding.
A month before the funding. So talk about the story with the funding. Just raising $700,000. You've just graduated. That's unusual. So what was that process like for you?
I think the company was at about 100,000 in revenue at that point.
Okay.
And I think
Cumulative or annual, 100,000 annual run rate?
that was annual.
Annual run rate.
Annual run rate. And I remember I camped out of my apartment. I got an apartment off campus because I graduated early. And I put together a list of 600 people that I was going to call and work. And 90% of them said no, right? We don't get it, like everything else. And I think that's actually fairly typical. Raising money in North Carolina is very different from raising money in the Valley in New York and I think other places. In North Carolina, you've got to have a real business to some extent to raise a significant amount of capital. But I did find those people that did believe in it. I had, my previous investors like IFC really go to bat for us. And really, really come to market for us and say, hey, these guys are great. They've got a good product. We get it. People will want this. And I remember the most interesting part about raising the money was it took a long time. It took 6 months. But the moment we got the money, I just remember panicking. Because it's like, okay, hey, a lot of people take a day break or whatever, a week break, and they're like, hey, I've raised my money. Like, this is great. We're going to move forwards. For me, I was like, wow, what do I do with this? I'm going to lose it all.
Right. What did I sign up for?
Right. What did I sign up for?
The pressure, right? Yeah.
And that's kind of like a weird part of my own personality that I think I've reflected on.
Sure.
Is like, when I'm scared of something, it motivates me to do it. And I'm just terrified the entire time until I come out the other side. But something still pushes me to do the thing that is scary.
Right. So, that's, I think that $700,000, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is,
right?
and for me, I was not wealthy. It was, so it felt so much larger than maybe everyone else thought. For the investors, it was, no one was going to lose their house over it. It was, angel investing is usually like fun for people.
Sure.
And they want money back, but it's not going to,
it's not going to break their
most
bank.
Startups are going to fail anyway, right? So,
right.
But for me, it just felt like this giant burden all of a sudden.
Got it.
Right.
And are you able to disclose what percent of those funds were local from North Carolina, and what percent of those were not from North Carolina?
100% were local.
100% local.
Well, in the South at least. We had some people come from Tennessee.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
So then let's talk about Y Combinator. So Y Combinator, for people that don't know, one of the top accelerators in the world, maybe the top accelerator in the world. Some of their alumni include Dropbox, Airbnb, Reddit. They've invested in, I think, 1,000 companies.
More than that, for
more
sure.
than that,
Right.
more than that. And so you apply, and they accept you into the fellowship. Just describe a little bit about what the experience with Y Combinator was.
It was good. So we went in, we did our interview.
Yep.
Right. It was 3 of the Y Combinator staff, and they grilled us. Right. It was probably the most intense interview I've ever had.
Yep.
It was probably harder than raising the money. And they say, and at the end, you get a call, and they say you're in. Which was awesome. I remember we were in San Francisco at the time, and I just remember being ecstatic. So they gave us $20,000. It was like a grant. It wasn't for equity or anything like that. And they gave us a mentor, right? So they gave us one of the founders of Woofu, which was a form company, who ended up being a great mentor to us and really kind of whipped us into shape and made us a little bit more metrics driven than we had been in the previous years.
So talk about that a little bit. We've talked about this a little bit. Y Combinator, one of the things that you told me before that struck you about it is that everyone had a metric.
Everyone had a metric.
And everyone was supposed to grow that metric over time, right?
Yeah. You're supposed to grow 20% week over week.
20% week. And so which metric did you settle on?
Money.
Revenue.
And
was
so at this point, one of the hardest metrics to choose.
Sure.
Right.
And so for people that are watching this that are thinking of maybe replicating that part of the experience to the extent that they can, just tell me, what was that experience like for you? Why did that goal end up actually be meaningful, 20% week over week revenue growth, as opposed to, hey, I said I would do that, but it's been a little bit hard, and then 3 months goes by. And so what is it about the program that actually made you commit to it?
I think it was that you had to continually notify yourself of where you were at. and conscientiously think about where you were and what you were doing.
Yep.
So I put up in my chart in my shower,
Yeah.
right? I laminated it. It had a chart
Yeah.
of our revenue.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would draw on it with
Right.
the expo marker.
Yeah, keep it right, top of mind, right? Yeah.
Right. And so if I got to the end of a week and it was
Yep.
Friday and that number was still flat,
Yep.
I felt awful.
Yeah.
Right. And it was more of a competition with myself.
Yep.
There wasn't like a punishment for not reaching that goal.
Yep.
But you begin to realize, you kind of train yourself like, okay, what did I do this week
Yep.
that is flat?
Yep.
And what did I do the previous week that number went up?
Sure.
And you start to conscientiously tie your own behaviors to those KPIs and figure out what works.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
You kind of set the goal, and then
Right.
suddenly your behaviors.
Right.
So talk a little bit, if we could just dive into this a little bit more. So you'd been operating the company for at least a year before that, maybe a couple years. So talk a little bit about that behavior change. Like, what did you start doing more of? It sounds like if your figure was sales, you did more sales.
Right.
And so you mentioned to me that you used a software platform called Persist Iq.
Right.
That was one thing that you used, and maybe you started cold calling people more or something like that. So just talk about what were some concrete things that actually changed for you.
Right.
But then the second part of the question is, after the program is done, how much of that stuck with you versus how much of that was like, okay, that was interesting to do for this time period, but now I'm going to kind of go back to something different. So,
Right.
But first, talk about the specific behaviors and tools that you may have used.
There were a few things. So there was one week where I did a lot of sales while going for a walk, because it was a stressful.
On the phone?
Yeah, just like walking.
Yeah.
And I realized that like when I'm sitting in a chair, and you could probably see this on the camera,
Yeah.
I'm a fidgeter, and
Okay.
so I can't keep still, right?
Yep.
I've got a lot of energy.
So maybe the walking was positive for.
The walking was very positive because
yeah.
I just I didn't have to think about my body. I was
Yep.
just zoned in on the call
Yep.
and was
Yep.
able to concentrate
Yep.
on that. And that did very well for me. And then I
Great.
think the other thing was we looked at what customers I sold each week, what
Yep.
kind of customers.
Yep.
And we saw that the number went up when we sold a particular kind of customer,
Yep.
right? Which were the people that were going ahead and redistributing our product.
Okay.
Right. We had our direct to farmer sales, but the
Yep.
people who were distributing the product did a lot better.
Right.
Right.
So just kind of more discipline, more rigorous thinking around sales and doing it every day, it sounds like.
Right, but it's also, unless you're keeping track of that stuff,
Yep.
you don't realize which behaviors are tied to which results.
Yep, got it. Okay, cool. And then and can you talk a little bit about Persist Iq? I've mentioned this tool to some people as being a really neat tool. What does it do? Because I think there's still a lot of people who don't know what this tool is. What does it do, and how was it helpful to you?
We've evolved to use a number of sales platforms
Okay,
now.
great.
Our Persist IQ, when we used it,
Yep.
essentially sent emails automatically,
Yep.
and then followed up with people a week
Yep.
later. Because I knew that one of the things I was awful at was organization.
Right.
And so if I had to follow up on 100 emails
Yeah.
later in the week, I knew there was no way I was going to be able
Right,
to do
right.
that.
So you have 100 potential customers, and if it's me, I'm just sending emails through Gmail, and
Right.
then maybe a week later, I'm like, I should reach out to a couple of them, but
Right.
not as thorough. So Persist IQ is just a tool that helped you be more thorough.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
okay,
right.
Good. So talk about after the program. So after the program, how do you evolve into kind of the comfortable state of both adopting what YC has taught you, but also kind of being true to yourself and to your culture
Right.
in the company, kind of thing?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of the Y Combinator culture stuck with us
Yeah.
as the company
That's
grew.
great.
Right, which was
Yeah.
being very metric focused,
Yeah.
being very blunt and honest with
Yep.
each other.
Yep.
I think that kind of idea of candor was something we learned through YC. And
In terms of interpersonal.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Telling someone when they're doing something wrong,
Yep.
not because you're upset at them, but because you want them to do better.
Right.
And you want
Right.
them to improve.
Right.
That kind of stuck with us. I think we as a company in North Carolina, in the South,
Yep.
had a very, very different culture, right?
Yep.
We were very revenue focused as opposed to some of the companies in YC. And so for us, that was maybe a little bit of the cultural difference that we kept around.
Got it. Got it. Cool. So then let's move forward in the story. So and I think we're probably skipping over a year or two
Right,
here.
right.
But you had some recent news, which is that FarmShots was acquired by Syngenta. Congratulations.
Yep, thank you.
And so I'm sure we're skipping lots of detail in between,
Right.
where we were and there. But just talk about how did you get to know Syngenta, and talk a little bit, to the extent that you can, about how that story came to be.
Right. So they were our customer before.
Yep.
The company had been working with Syngenta, I think, for about 6-7 months. And I ended up having lunch with one of the folks who was one of the heads of digital agriculture at Syngenta.
Yep.
A guy named Dan Burdett, who's now my boss and an incredible mentor.
Great.
And said, hey, we should deepen this partnership and grow together. And that's where the conversation really started, and it was, it's been incredible so far.
Got it.
Incredible
Good.
so far.
Great.
Yeah.
And so now you're at Syngenta, and you have been working there the last month or so.
2 months.
2 months.
Been
Got
2
it.
months now.
Great. Well, that's great. All right. Well, let's. Is there anything else that I missed maybe in those intervening years there that would be interesting for you to say? Maybe if you're able to disclose, what did you get your AIR to? Did you raise any more money? What was the team size roughly?
Yeah, we didn't raise all that much more money.
Okay.
The company
Yep.
started doing. We weren't at profitability,
Yeah.
but we were.
But you were making
pretty
enough money
close
to
it.
pay your bills. Yep.
Pretty close to it.
Yep.
Yeah. Grew the team. In fact, we had none of the original members by the time the company exited,
Yep.
except for myself.
Yep. And the team was roughly how big?
4 people.
4 people?
Four
Yep.
people at the
Yep.
time. Right.
Yep.
And then we had some contractors doing work for us and stuff like that.
Yep, got
But
it.
yeah, really 4 full-time employees.
Got it. And so you were working out of HQ Raleigh.
We were.
Which is a co-working space that was co-founded by some Duke alums,
Right.
including Jesse Lipson and Brooks Bell, and Christopher Gergen. And so for people that are watching this that want to know what it's like to kind of work in Raleigh, what was that experience like for you?
And it was an incredible community.
Yeah.
I owe a lot to HQ.
Yep.
It was nice finally being surrounded by other entrepreneurs,
Yep.
right? Or at least entrepreneurs that were further along than I was.
Yep.
I'd spent a lot of time with entrepreneurs at Duke who were closer to my age,
Right.
and closer to my stage of a
Peers,
company.
if you will, right?
Peers,
Yeah.
and then going to HQ Raleigh was all of a sudden, you're in the big leagues now,
Right.
and you've got to play ball,
Right.
but there's also people there to help you.
So let's go back to your time at Duke. So we've talked a little bit about the Cube, and you were in that with Tati and Jake. We talked a little bit about Melissa and Doug Entrepreneurs. Were there any other parts of your experience at Duke that were important for either you personally or important for FarmShots?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing was when I came to Duke, I was very nervous about starting a company. I knew I wanted to do it. It was something that was scary for me. And so the first thing was really finding mentors. And so for me, the first people that ever mentored me were Jake and Tati, as
Right.
we talked about first.
Right.
Right. And
Talk a little bit about that, because
Right.
they were a little bit older than you,
2 years older.
2 years older than you, and you're sleeping on their couch freshman summer.
Right.
And they become mentors for you. And so what does that mean exactly, that they were mentors for you?
I mean, they had been through it, so they had already been working on their companies
Right.
for a year and 2 years,
And for people that are watching this, so Tatiana,
Right.
founder of Mati Energy, a
Right.
healthy energy drink, she's raised $8 million. And Jake Stock, he is founder of Neural Plus,
Right.
which is a really cool company. He's raised some money too.
Right.
So okay, so they're mentoring you, and like, what does that mean exactly?
It meant a couple things.
Yeah.
It meant okay, there were a lot of things that were new to me.
Yep.
I wasn't used to getting hung up on when you called people, when you're doing sales and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of things that I was like, this is awful.
Yeah.
Right. I'm
Dealing
doing
with rejection.
I'm doing everything wrong, like nothing is working.
Yeah.
And they were like, that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Nothing's supposed to work.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be that 5% of the things you try work.
Right. So
and
maybe normalizing it a little bit. Right?
normalizing
Yeah.
it, right? And that was maybe the biggest and most important part, was having people that had been through it before,
Yep.
who are incredible founders and incredible people,
Yep.
tell me that it's okay.
Yep.
That it's okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's now move to maybe just reflecting a little bit about some maybe abstract things or concrete things that you learned and would like for others to know. So, we have many Duke undergraduate startups
Right.
that are coming through, who are going through a lot of the same experiences, stumbles, chances to learn. And so, do you have any kind of advice that you would give for them, either abstract or specific?
I can't curse, right?
I think you could curse. I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe we could edit it out.
Well,
It's important. It's important.
how
that I
about you curse and I'll say beep at this?
You just yell it really loud. Okay.
Beep.
No, the important.
Perfect.
We'll have to time
Perfect
that
timing.
perfectly.
Yeah, we have
Well,
to work on the timing.
The important part to remember, and I think was the scariest thing for me, and took a lot of time for me to learn, is everyone and every startup is a shit show.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There are more things that should go wrong
Yep.
than go right.
Yep. It's
and
really hard in our culture, especially for people that get to Duke,
Who are
you've
usually-
spent kindergarten through 12th grade getting everything right.
Right.
Every test answer right.
Right.
Winning all the awards.
Right.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're failing day after day
Right.
after day
Right.
after day.
Oh, that guy told me he doesn't want to talk to me, kind of thing.
Well, sometimes they don't even tell you.
They don't
They
even-
curse you out, and then they'll
Hey,
hang up.
don't
They're
call
not
me.
like, "Hey, don't call me."
Right.
That's the number one thing. Is it's normal.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is the
Yeah.
hardest thing for Duke students specifically.
Yeah.
Is to normalize failure, because we're so used to.
Yep.
A lot of us did really well in high school.
Yep.
Normalizing that failure is the biggest thing you can do as an entrepreneur.
Yep.
And making sure you learn from that failure, not just beat yourself up over it.
Yep.
I think that was the biggest thing that I learned, and it took me the longest to learn.
Yep. And so, to some degree, just reflecting back on Tatiana and Jake,
Right.
that was a big thing that they helped you with, was as you were
Right.
going through these things, they helped you with that. Maybe also, to reflect back on Melissa and Doug, seeing their success, and they're such, they're so modest about all the
Right.
missteps that they've made in their careers, and
Right.
so they kind of normalize it a little bit. And then maybe with Chris Rhodes,
Right.
just him being able to tell you like, hey,
Right.
here's how to think about this kind
Right.
of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of instilled in me this lifelong craving of failure, as weird as that sounds. So it's like, I want to try. If you're not trying something that's hard enough to make you fail every once in a while,
Yep.
then you're probably not doing the right thing. You're not challenging yourself, so you're not growing.
Yep.
You want to fail,
Yep.
because if you're not failing, then
You're not pushing hard
then
enough.
you're not
maybe.
pushing hard enough. Right. That's exactly right.
Yep. What other learnings come to mind? And we can take some time here to reflect on it. But what other learnings come to mind? What other pieces of advice would you want to give? If
Right.
if you were to talk to 1,000 Duke undergrads,
Right.
what are some other pieces of advice that come to mind?
Right. It's if you're afraid of something, you should run towards it, not away from it, and just consciously train yourself to do that.
Do you have a specific example that comes to mind from your experience?
Raising money, right?
Yeah.
I was afraid of it.
Yeah.
And the moment it happened,
Because how do you do it?
I was like, oh
Yeah.
God, what am I gonna do?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I figured it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there were nights of panic and everything like
6
that.
months. 6 months. It took 6 months to do,
Right.
and
Right.
probably got a lot of ups and downs there, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
I think the important part of that, and running towards things that are afraid of you, you're afraid of,
Yep.
you slowly, when you go back to do that thing again, you're not afraid of it. And so what you're doing by running towards things that you're afraid of is you're taking that sphere of things you're capable of and
Yep.
and not afraid of,
Yep.
and you're moving that boundary outwards.
Yep.
And so my goal in life,
Yep.
I'm scared of everything. I am not a brave person. But to just go do those things that I'm afraid of,
Yep.
till all of a sudden, I'm still not a brave person, but I've done all the things I could be afraid of. And then there's no more reason to be afraid.
Right. Good.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your selection of idea? So one thing about your idea is that I think it was one of the best ideas we had seen that year. In fact, I might say that it was the best idea. I'm thinking of some of the scoring I saw on a bunch of ideas, and and the idea that that ended up becoming FarmShots was the highest scored idea for that year. The previous year, as we said, you had done a website design business for restaurants in Durham. And so, and we've seen our fair share of lots of ideas, whether they were friends of yours in the Cube or whatnot. And so where do you settle down on the spectrum of like, just take an idea and go for it versus like start with a great idea, right? So there's kind of a lot of people that have different opinions as to where to go. So how do you think about that when you're thinking about what idea to select for your startup?
There's nothing that can replace execution, and there are plenty of bad ideas out there, but there are also plenty of good enough ideas, right? That if you worked hard enough, if you were clever enough, if you worked the right angles, could turn into a beautiful big business, right? And I think sometimes people get too caught up in the notion of an idea. And they're like, I'm not going to found a company because this idea is not good enough. The thing to remember is, even if you start with an okay idea, you'll learn and that'll change into a good idea. And the good idea will change into a great idea. Very rarely do you start with a great idea. Right? And for me, a lot of I can't even take credit for my own idea to some extent.
Maybe other people preceded you and said, here's a good idea.
Well, there were standing on the shoulders of giants to some extent, and then also it was listening to a customer's problem, right? And not necessarily coming up with a novel solution, but putting together the right pieces and putting together the right problem with those pieces. Like that idea came out of that, but I don't take credit for that because all it was the combination of a problem and some technologies that had already been in existence. And so I think my advice to people would be, think less about the idea and think more about the opportunity.
Cool.
Because a good idea, if done right, can be better than a great idea done poorly.
So one thing that, so just to pull on this thread a little bit more, so a couple ways that people have described, finding a good enough idea. So one way that people have described it that I've seen is find something which is a painkiller, not a vitamin. Something that solves a pain as opposed to is a nice to have.
Right.
The other thing that I've heard, and there's some studies that point to this and whatnot, go for an idea that has like a 10x improvement over the current existing things that are going on. So as you think about the specific idea that FarmShots took to market, do you think that you fit either of those categories?
I think the
10x better than what they were doing before, where what they were doing what farmers were doing
walking
before.
Walking around
the farm, so much less precise, very labor intensive. And what about the painkiller versus vitamin thing? Do you feel that you
were... Well, that's a pain to have to walk around. I 100% agree with that. Right? I will spend money all day on Advil. Multivitamin, not so much. I forget to take my multivitamin. And part of that is pain is something you have a constant reminder of every time you go through it. Where a multivitamin, something that could be better, you don't have a reminder that you need that or want that, right? It's kind of a passing thought, where every time you go through something that's difficult or painful, you are reminded of that need.
Oh my gosh, I have to walk the fields again today for
whatever,
an hour.
Whatever it might be.
Pivoting is a word that a lot of people use for startups, and that kind of connects into what we're talking about. If I remember correctly, I feel like you did have maybe a small pivot early on, but I don't know that you ever had a really big pivot with this idea. So if I remember correctly, I think a small pivot you had was, instead of using drones to capture footage of farms, use pre-existing satellite data. Is that true? That was one of your pivots?
Very, very, very early.
Very early.
Like
very
pretty
early.
much second month of working on the company.
But to be fair, I think it's accurate to say that there was no major pivot with FarmShots. Like, the idea for a long time was help farmers better assess their farms.
There was never a pivot on the technical side. I agree with that. But from the business side, there was a large pivot in terms of how we go to market.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, and so first we started selling to farmers.
To farmers directly.
It just, we didn't have the connection. They didn't trust us.
Yep.
Why would they want to talk to us?
So almost a direct-to-consumer business, if you will.
Right, which was not really what the product fit for, because we weren't farmers.
Yeah.
What right did we have to sell into that industry?
Yep.
Instead, we decided to go and sell to the people that worked with farmers and advised farmers.
The agronomists.
Right. Which turned out to be good on two fronts, right?
Yep.
We all of a sudden had people that were very willing to try technology.
Right.
Actually, three things. Very willing to try technology as opposed to the farmers that are busy doing their work,
Yep.
right? We had people that, had a market at scale. They were working on 30 farms or 50 farms,
Yep.
not just one farm.
Yep.
Right, so it was a larger contract size.
Yep.
And then three, we didn't sacrifice that much margin by doing that.
Right.
It made sales a lot more efficient, and
Got it.
that ended up becoming the company's pretty much entire business model.
Got it.
We do very little direct to grower
Yep.
work.
So pretty important pivot that
Right.
that really
100%.
made the business possible. if you will.
100%.
Right. Yeah. So my last question is just around entrepreneurship at Duke, and so you've been a part of what we've been doing, but I don't know that we've ever had this part of the conversation, which is what do you think is the future of entrepreneurship at Duke, or what is the future that you would like to see? Put another way, if you were in charge of entrepreneurship at Duke and led it for the next, 30 or 40 years, what would success look like? What would the metric look like?
I don't think I could do nearly as good of a job as you leading it for the next 30 or 40 years. It was nice to see that, I guess it would have been 6 years ago now, when I started.
Yep.
Entrepreneurship at Duke has wildly changed, and I think that's all thanks to you, to a large extent.
Definitely not all thanks to me, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Largely
well,
in my eyes. At least my entrepreneurial experience
Sure,
and the changes
okay.
that I witnessed were largely.
We've spent a
thanks
lot
to
of time together.
you. We have, and that's why we're sick of each other.
Yep.
Again, it's become normalized. It was when I think I started out.
Yep.
I think people thought you were crazy, or it was like not a valid career path. Because when everyone's going to medical school and getting $150,000 out of school or whatever it might be, it's so hard to go in the other direction.
Yeah.
Even if you believe it deep down.
Yep.
You just see everyone else doing something safer.
How can you turn down the offer to make $100,000 at Goldman Sachs to start a company that may or may not be around in 6 months?
And I think when I started that, when I started my company,
Yeah.
that's exactly what the sentiment was. And I
Yeah.
think looking at the entrepreneurs I meet now out of Duke, they're the cool kids, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones that are doing.
That's interesting.
It's interesting. Like Goldman
Yeah.
Sachs and everything else is now boring.
Yeah.
Compared to what these
Yeah.
kids are doing, and I think that's a cultural shift that has happened, on a gradient over the last 6 years.
So maybe one goal is just to continue on that gradient, on that slope there.
Yeah,
Right?
that would be awesome.
And that's a great notion. And putting that aside, what's maybe just one more big thought you would have for Duke entrepreneurship 30 years from now? Like, what feels like big success?
I want to see us producing founders that do something straight out of school. I think Duke's got a large number of entrepreneurs that choose to do something later in life.
Okay.
I think
So maybe smoothing that path that makes it possible to do something right out of school, right?
and I don't take for granted that not everyone can do that,
Yeah.
right? With student loans and things like that.
Yep.
It's
daunting. It can be really daunting.
It can be really hard. And I
Absolutely.
don't blame people for not doing it.
Right.
But if you can do it right out of school,
Yep.
I think it's one of the best, or during school,
Yep.
I think it's one of the best times to start a company because you
Yep.
don't have kids, you don't have a spouse, you don't have a mortgage.
Right.
If you fail, you can get back up on your feet in a year, 2 years, and figure it out. And if you want to end up at Goldman Sachs, you can. Where the risk when you do it so much later in life is so much higher.
Yep.
And so my challenge is why not do it now,
Right.
right? Now is the best time you will have to do that,
Yep.
right?
So just go for it and
Just
give
go
a
for
shot.
it. Just go for it.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Yeah,
This
thank
was
you,
great.
Howie.